Hey everyone, my name is Andrew Barry and I'm an innovation lead at Worksafe Victoria. And today I'm going to be discussing the topic of designing for the 25% and share some thoughts from myself and from my team on how we go about creating deliberately inclusive public services. So I'm going to start today by discussing and providing a little bit of context, I guess, to Worksafe itself. I'm mindful that some people watching this video may not know anything about Worksafe Victoria and the work that it does. I'm then going to talk a little bit about our team in innovation and the way that we're structured, and then talk about, I guess, the context in which we work. I'm then going to dive into some thoughts and hopefully some practical learnings on designing inclusive products and services. And I'm then going to talk about the idea of scaling up and how we go from initial design exploration through to eventual implementation of our work, but in a safe way and in a way that's kind of mindful of the context in which we work. And then hopefully I'm going to tie all this together with a few takeaways that hopefully might be relevant to your line of work. Okay, so let's start with a quick introduction to Worksafe Victoria. This is the description of Worksafe that I scraped off our public-facing website the other day. And it does a good job, at least functionally, of describing what we do. And that is that Worksafe Victoria is our state's health and safety regulator and the manager of Victoria's workers' compensation scheme. And I learned from our website the other day that we've been doing this now for about 35 years or so. But to put it a little bit more simply, our purpose is basically to help prevent injuries in the workplace and to provide support for workers in the event that they are harmed in that workplace. To give you a sense, I guess, of the scale at which we operate and the amount of people that we interact with and the types of services that we provide. In the last financial year, we provided approximately 82,000 injured workers with financial support for medical treatment and or weekly benefits, or a combination of both of those things. Of the 82,000, approximately 28,000 were new claims that came through our system. So 28,000 new injuries in the workplace that have then manifested themselves in being a workers' compensation claim. And this last statistic here, the 14.3%, this is actually that's the percentage of new claims that came through our system that were for managing a primary mental injury. And this is, I guess this last number for us is really quite significant and is something that we're spending a lot of time in our team thinking about in terms of the work that we do. Because the good news is that slowly over time within Worksafe, we're seeing the amount of physical injuries decrease, or at least kind of remain relatively consistent over time. However, we are sadly starting to see a bit of an exponential increase over the last couple of years in the amount of people in the workforce who are suffering from a mental injury, be it post-traumatic stress or anxiety or depression. And this, I guess, kind of gives us a lot to contemplate in terms of the sustainability of our scheme, because these injuries can be quite complex and quite difficult to manage and tend to spend a lot more time kind of away from work with a longer claim duration. Okay, so I want to talk now a little bit about our team in innovation. So innovation within Worksafe has only been in existence for roughly 2 years now. So in the grand scheme of the 35 years that Worksafe has been around for, we're kind of the new kids on the block. We've only been around for a short amount of time. We've tried to develop out what we think is quite a deliberately multidisciplinary practice. And it includes some of us who have come from different areas of design, be it the more kind of strategic kind of service design areas, right through to some of the more executional elements of design, so in user experience and interaction design. We have different technologists in our group as well, so different front-end developers and back-end developers, and kind of everywhere in between those two spaces. And we also have a lot of people in our team who are health experts and have come from different areas in the health industry. I like to say, though, that regardless of where you come from and what your background is in our team and what it says on your LinkedIn profile, we all tend to have a background to varying degrees in human-centered design. And most of the people who have joined our team tend to be very driven by making a positive impact to the community. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the way that we structure our group, and our team in innovation, those 28 people, are broken into 4 different portfolio areas that we've developed to address very specific business and strategic priorities. And these areas, in short, are starting from left to right here. Firstly, the prevention group, who partner with different areas of the business to help reduce injuries in the workplace. So they spend a lot of time with people like our enforcement and our inspectorate teams, who spend a lot of time directly out working with workers and employers to help look for opportunities to reduce injuries in the workplace. The second team is recovery, and that's the space that I'm responsible for managing at the moment. And our remit is to essentially develop new products and services targeted at improving recovery outcomes for all of the people who are involved in managing a workplace injury. So that's not just an injured worker, but can also include the injured worker's employer, the insurance agents who manage those claims, and the different people obviously within the health system as well, who might be managing that injury. The last couple of areas that we have are more outwardly facing teams. So we have the community team, who do really amazing work with different community organisations to co-design new health and safety initiatives. And lastly, our ventures team, who's in the very kind of early stages, I guess, of figuring out what it means for a government regulator like Worksafe to collaborate with the startup community and other external providers to explore new product opportunities, R&D ops, etc. Okay, so I'm now going to dive into sharing a few thoughts and some learnings about how we go about designing inclusive products and services for the Victorian community. And I'm also going to touch a little bit, I guess, on digital transformation. Because Worksafe, like many public service organisations at the moment, are in the middle of large-scale digital transformation. So I think it's important to acknowledge that context. And to kick off that conversation, I guess I want to, firstly talk about core assumption of digitally transforming public services that I feel has kind of followed me for the last few years in the work that I've been doing in the public sector, whether it be in the last couple of years I've been at Worksafe or previously when I was working as a design consultant, but also working with different federal or state organisations. And the core assumption, I guess, for me around digitally transforming public services at the moment tends to go a little bit like this. If we digitise our current state processes and create new products and services for our clients and our customers, in the future, roughly 75% of these people who currently interact with our organisations, so that big green area there of the 75%, our assumption is that they'll be able to do so in a digital channel and effectively self-service in the future. And I guess the assumption then follows that if we do that and we do that well, we'll be able to increase our bandwidth to manage the 25% of customers who we assume will have higher servicing needs and potentially fall out, I guess, of some of those digital channels. And I guess, the assumption sounds logical. And, when I first heard it a few years back, I thought to myself, if what we're trying to do here is to increase bandwidth and unlock, capabilities to better service some of the people in our community who we see as potentially being more vulnerable, then that seems like a reasonably sound assumption and a great aspiration. But what we've found, I think, in our team, especially over the last couple of years, that it's really useful to spend more time trying to understand the core needs of the 25% in order to design more inclusively and accessibly for everyone in the community and everyone who interacts with us. So what do I mean by this? So for an organisation like Worksafe, if we break down that 25% of people who we assume are going to be high touch or have greater servicing needs, we start to see an incredibly diverse range of backgrounds and lived experience. So for example, within that 25% who interact with us, we're going to have people who come from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. We're going to have people in our community who have, wildly different experiences and levels of health and digital literacy. We're going to have lots of people as well who have different and varying degrees of injury complexities, be it pre-existing injuries that they've had before a workplace injury, or the fact that they could also be managing multiple injuries at the same time. And then we've also got the impact, I guess, that geography and industry type plays, because we do know from our research that for an injured worker, depending on whether or not you're from a metropolitan area or a suburban area, or whether or not you come from regional Victoria, is going to have quite a bit of impact on your access to certain health services. We also know that different industry types as well have different levels of experience with workers' compensation. They can also tend to have different levels of stigma or acknowledgement as well of different injury types. And so it's important as well at this point to note that some of these attributes and these dimensions that we're talking about in terms of what makes up a high-touch person may equally apply not only to injured workers, but also to the employers who they work for, the healthcare providers who manage their injuries, and also to the insurance agents, the different companies that we work with to provide that service to injured workers. So what happens if we flip this assumption? And I guess that this is what we've ended up doing in our team. And what happens if we firstly focus on designing for the 25% first? That doesn't mean that we don't acknowledge the needs of the mainstream 75%, but what if we focus on the people that we think may be the more vulnerable first? I think the first thing that we discover is that the number is generally a lot higher, especially when we consider the diversity of the entire Victorian community. And the fact that really anyone managing a workplace injury generally isn't at their best. They are generally stressed, they are generally dealing with hardship, and this has a dramatic impact on their experience. I think the second thing that we definitely discover is that their needs often don't align with our assumptions about things like their channel preferences, the way they want to interact with the service. To offer, I guess, a concrete example of this, we've been doing a lot of work around designing certain digital touch points that would enable someone who's managing a primary mental injury with us in the future. And I think that our going in assumption with this work was that if a worker happened to be suffering, for example, from post-traumatic stress or from depression or anxiety, they would have a much higher likelihood of wanting to drop out to human services or spend more time on the phone or directly interacting with claims managers. And what we've actually found through our research is that this assumption doesn't really hold at all, that we've actually discovered that people who are suffering from a primary mental injury are actually much more likely to interact with us through a digital channel. And this is mainly because they had, especially in the early stages of their injury, they haven't really built up the language or the vocabulary to be comfortable actually discussing that with another human being yet, especially someone that they don't know or trust. I think the last thing that we definitely discovered by taking this approach is that focusing on the complex and sometimes really difficult to hear stories from people who have interacted with our scheme does tend to shape really great work. And so what I mean by this is not only just in terms of being able to practically apply, I guess, the things that we learn from these people's lived experience, but there's also something else at play here. And I think that this is it. The impact tends to be in the way that it increases empathy and creates a space within the organisation itself for discussing who we're really designing for. And this definitely kind of plays into the way that we prioritise work. Okay, so how do we go about actually understanding the needs of diverse audiences and acknowledging those needs and ensuring we're designing inclusive services? And I guess the short answer in terms of what we've learned from our team is that we need to speak to people, and a lot of people from across the community, and try and make sure they play an active role in the development of the work itself. So to bring this to life a little bit, I just kind of want to run through some stats that I've plucked out from the work that we've been doing in the recovery team over the last 18 months. And so within that 18 months, we have been developing out a lot of these digital touch points that all workers will be using in the future to interact with us if they have been unfortunate enough to suffer an injury in the workplace. And within that time, we've conducted about over 120 or so one-on-one interviews and tests with different injured workers from a very deliberately diverse range of injury types, backgrounds and experiences. We've also spoken to over 80 healthcare providers, clinical specialists, medical legal staff, insurance agents and employers, once again from a very deliberately diverse range of backgrounds, organizational scale types, and then diverse as well, hopefully, in terms of the split across both metropolitan and regional Victoria as well. And within that period, we've developed around about over 50 individual service interventions or prototypes that have been tested and co-designed with the Victorian working community, which is something that we're very proud of in our group. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about scaling up and how it is that our work itself progresses from early design exploration and some of the prototype work that we do right the way through to eventual implementation. And so at Worksafe, like any large organization, we are constantly looking for opportunities to scale our work, to get it out faster and to see the impact from it. But in our line of work, and considering the people that we design for and the unfortunate experiences that they can sometimes be moving through, we need to be mindful, I think, of the impact, both positive and potentially negative, we could have on people's lives with any of the changes that we make. And beyond this, I guess going back to the reminder of Worksafe being a health and safety regulator for the state, we also need to consider really carefully the potential for reputation or political risk. So how do we go about it? So our work progresses from idea to, the way that our work idea progresses from initial ideation and hunches through to a solution would be no great surprise, I don't think, for anyone who has a background in iterative design. So kind of starting here from left to right, our team basically starts in a very divergent and an exploratory space. We very deliberately do a lot of prototyping, be it digital prototyping or service mock-ups or different interventions to try out different concepts and variations. Once we've established, I guess, at least some basic desirability around the idea, we start to narrow in our focus and then take things into a more formal pilot state, in which we're either testing a single concept or maybe a couple of competing concepts in the wild. And it's important to point out that for us, piloting means this is the first time that we're hitting the reality of the organization. We're actually starting to test these things out on live claims. And if we start to see the proposed impact, or we're starting to validate our own assumptions or hypotheses about what we thought would happen, we then consider investing in developing out an MVP, and then I guess kind of almost transferring the responsibility to an extent of that work into some of our kind of large digital transformation streams and more the implementation side of the business. In that pilot stage, though, as we're starting to make things more real, we need to really carefully consider risk. And I dare say that sometimes we even need to consider the ethics of what we're doing and of testing new ideas on live claims when we could be potentially impacting on someone's recovery from a workplace injury. So the way, I guess, to explain the way that we have decided to try and mitigate against this risk is to take a very deliberately scaled approach to our pilot design. So the way that we go about this, if we take a look at that first bubble there in our pilot A, we very deliberately start with a small amount of claims and very small numbers. So in our world, that could be as little as starting our test by only testing with 5 live claims that come through our system. If we see, if the results are positive, I guess, from running that pilot for a short amount of time, then we'll potentially scale the numbers, start to look at maybe 20 to 50 live claims coming through the system. And we start to kind of take a look at potentially including different injury types as well as part of that pilot itself. And so we slowly and very deliberately increase the scale and our learnings as we go. Important to point out, of course, that in the early stages of these pilots, we may not be learning enough to actually drive big decisions or decision making, because with those numbers in mind, we're probably not seeing anything at that point that's statistically significant. But what's more important for us and our team at that point in time, that we're at least learning enough to ensure that we're not doing any further harm. And this is important not only in terms of recognising that we're not doing any further harm to the injured worker involved, but it's really important as well in terms of de-risking these moves for our stakeholders. Okay, so I want to share a little bit about what we've learned about this approach so far. And so the first one, like I was describing, this is basically an opportunity for us to test in a safe way and in a safe environment. And what I mean by this is not just safety in terms of an injured worker, their experience, and also the safety for the staff who support them, but it's also a really great way to bed down, I guess, kind of nervousness about that work and de-risk that work for our internal stakeholders as well. The other thing that we've learned is that this is the first time doing pilots in this way gives us a great way to actually understand longitude for the first time. So up until that point of the pilot, we may have tested multiple prototypes and different kind of and different interventions that are really just a snapshot in time. Using a scale pilot approach allows us to understand what the potential impact of those products and services may be over a duration of time, and see what the impact will be on that injured worker and our staff members' experience as well. The last thing is that this piloting approach gives us a fantastic way to de-risk some of our capability and system assumptions. A lot of the time when we're going to pilot, we certainly haven't developed out an end-to-end ecosystem yet, or have everything, all of our ducks lined up yet in terms of what that the future state product or service may be. But this is a really fantastic way for us to at least test some of those core assumptions that we might have about how our core systems might work, or how this might work in the future. Okay, and I want to sum up, I guess, by saying that I think for our team, the thing that we've discovered is that the most important learning by far is that the organisation needs to be exposed to lived experience and feedback right through the design and development process. And this is essentially one of the key reasons why we're very deliberate in the approach that we take to moving from early stage prototyping through to piloting and then through to an MVP state. Okay, so I want to sum up today by sharing some key takeaways or a bit of a summary. And so the first takeaway, I think, from me is not to rest on latent assumptions, especially when it comes to digital transformation. I think that there is a lot of talk about the promise of digital transformation, which I think is great. And I think it's fantastic that in many of our large public sector organizations, many people are on that journey, but I think in terms of when it comes to how we do that inclusively and equitably as well, we definitely have to test some of those latent assumptions about how people will interact with our public services in the future. The second thing is design for complex needs first. And, I think that what we've discovered is that if you design for the complex needs first, then the other needs generally tend to figure themselves out, or at least you'll end up with a far more holistic overview, I guess, of what those needs might be. The third thing is de-risk your testing by starting really small. I think that this is really important, especially in quite risk adverse and quite complex large organizations. There can be a feeling of nervousness around introducing new services or products into an ecosystem. And so we definitely find that by starting small, learning incrementally and scaling up incrementally definitely does help to de-risk things and bed down that nervousness. And the last thing for me is to use lived experience to influence culture and increase organizational empathy. I think that this is an incredibly important thing when it comes to how we develop better products and services in the future. Okay, so that's all from me today. I don't unfortunately do Twitter. Blame Donald Trump for that one. But if you want to chat any further about any of the things that I've been talking about today, feel free to catch me on my email address or on LinkedIn. Thanks. Have a great day.